Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Staff Sergeant Horan, and today we are going to be talking about cancer. Does anyone know of anyone who has known someone with cancer or has personally had it themselves? Unfortunately, cancer is a very bad thing and the cases are rising. However, on the contrary, so are the treatments and cure discoveries. Medicine is evolving rapidly, and I want to share some of those evolutions with you. My mother is a cancer survivor. She kicked cancer's hiney, and I want to spread the strength she had to those who may feel affected by this lecture. This is what we're going to talk about today. Without reference, identify basic characteristics of the top 10 cancers in the United States with at least 70% accuracy. We're going to talk about the number one in America, which is skin cancer. We're going to move on to lung cancer and what causes that, as well as male and female cancers such as prostate and breast cancer. We're also going to discuss colorectal cancer and kidney cancer. We're also going to discuss bladder cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I have a great story to tell you about that. We're also going to wrap up with thyroid cancer and endometrial cancer. Our second objective, we're also going to discuss, without reference, identify basic characteristics of older and modern cancer treatments with at least 70% accuracy. I want to talk about cancer treatments before the 2000s and modern forms of cancer treatment. But before we break it down to some of these amazing discoveries, let's discuss the top 10 cancers here in America. Starting with skin cancer. Can anyone tell me what this is formally called? Melanoma. Yes, that's right. It is formally known as melanoma. Again, reiterating, it is the number one cancer here in America. The chance of it increases with age, specifically over the age of 40 and in women. And I think a reason for this, not so much in women, but as people get older, is when people retire, they tend to move to warmer climates, right? My grandma lived in Seattle, Washington, and she retired in Phoenix, Arizona, and she actually had a basal cell carcinoma on her nose that she had to get surgically removed. So I think heat and warmer climate definitely has something to do with that. Also, wear your sunscreen. This can also form in the eyes, nose, and throat. This is a little bit more of the advanced stages. You're not going to see this when it's so early on. Of course, tanning beds and UV radiation is going to bump up that risk. There are good and bad rays of sunshine, right? Reminder, wear your sunblocks. How do we want to diagnose this? We want to do what is called a punch or a shave biopsy, and I'm going to draw you what that is. So I have a little marker board up here. We're going to do this together. So I'm going to draw my mole. We're going to draw the little punch. And let's draw a needle. So what we're going to do is, here's our site. We are going to clean it with alcohol. That's what we do to always clean things off first. We're then going to take this needle and we're going to inject some kind of anesthetic to numb it up because it's going to hurt. We're then going to take this punch biopsy, which kind of looks similar to this pen, and we're going to press it over the lesion and press the button, and that will take tissue off. We will then put it in a cup and we're going to send that off to the lab. If the results are positive, we are now going to put this under a microscope and determine the stages. Now, the stages go from 0 to 4, and I'm going to break those down for you. Stage 0, basically cancer is confirmed in the outermost layer of the skin. Stage 1, the tumor is no more than 2 millimeters thick, so it's still a little tiny guy. Stage 2, the tumor is thicker than 4 millimeters, so we're getting a little bit bigger now. Stage 3, the cancer has spread to 1 to 3 nearby lymph nodes, so it's starting to branch out a little bit, right? And stage 4, this cancer has spread to other lymph nodes, it's spread to other organs like the liver, the kidneys. This is obviously your more serious serious stage of cancer. And what can we do for treatments? Well, there's something called an excision. I'm going to explain how this is. Similar to the punch biopsy, we're gonna remove that foreign lesion out of the body and then send it off to lab for further testing. But it's essentially the same thing. We are going to numb the site so that they don't feel pain, and we're gonna use something sharp like a scalpel or a dermablade, and we're just gonna scoop that little sucker up, put it in a cup, and send that off right to lab. Now that we talked about melanoma, let's discuss the number 2 cancer here in America, which is lung cancer. This is number 2 in America, however, it's number 1 worldwide. Can anyone take a guess on what the leading cause of lung cancer is? Correct, smoking, absolutely right. There are 2 types of lung cancers I'm gonna touch up on. One is called small cell, and one is called non-small cell. So your small cell, that's basically exclusive to the heavy smokers. Non-small cell is basically an easy way to categorize the other several types. An example of this is squamous cell carcinoma. There are risk factors involved with this. I want to talk about that with you. Sadly, secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke is when you are exposed to someone who smokes. You don't even have to be directly around them. You can just smell their clothes every day. Just that chronic exposure a little bit at a time can actually lead to lung cancer. Previous exposure to radiation, which I have a story for that later, I'll go in depth with, and exposure to asbestos, because that is not a good thing to breathe in. There are signs and symptoms involved with lung cancer. These occur after the early stages. However, coughing up blood, shortness of breath, and chest pain. There's not really a lot of signs and symptoms in the beginning of it. I'm now going to draw what a healthy lung looks like and what a smoker's lung looks like on the marker board. You just as excited as me? I'm gonna draw a little vertebrae here. And okay. I'm now drawing my smoker's lung. And what we're looking at here is, notice how I'm not touching the lung over here. This lung is healthy. It is smooth, it's spongy, it looks soft, it looks squishy. You don't really see anything wrong with it. However, this lung over here looks cloudy and dark, and I even see some black spots going on over here, which probably means that is dead tissue. Can you imagine trying to breathe or even run a lap with a lung like this versus a lung like this? I want to tell a story about a dog I rescued back when I lived in Florida. I fostered a senior dog. He was 13 years old. His name was Sam, cutest thing. I was fostering him because the mom was actually admitted to the hospital for lung cancer. I was sending her pictures periodically of Sam, just giving her little updates, and for several weeks I didn't hear from her, so I got kind of concerned. Well, she had reached out to me and she had said, sorry, it's been so chaotic in the hospital. I actually just got my entire left lung removed, and I couldn't even imagine how she was in there alone. Like, there was nobody there for her. She had no family near her. Like, how extreme that was. And it all came back from smoking, that she had to have an entire lung removed. Can you even imagine that? Now that we've dove into lungs, let's continue to our number 3 in America, which is prostate cancer. Now your prostate, or not your, excuse me, in men, it is a small walnut-shaped gland in men. This is a common cancer in men. Basically, it's a pileup of abnormal cells, and I'm gonna try and explain how a tumor is formed. There's a mutation in the normal cells, and then they start to just go crazy, and they build really, really fast, and now those good cells that normally just die naturally are now living longer than they're supposed to because they've been mutated, and now this buildup of cells is causing this lesion, and then therefore it turns into a tumor. A cancer like this also increases with age. Have you noticed that a lot of these cancers increase with age? Interesting enough, breast cancer gene 1 and breast cancer gene 2 increases the risk of prostate cancer if a man has a family history of that. Isn't that interesting how those two tie together? Isn't that wild that something over there can tie into something over here? There's also no real signs or symptoms in the early stage, as you've noticed so far. That's kind of a lot in these cancers. Once it's spread, it is unlikely to be cured. It may respond to treatment and it may be controlled, but it's unlikely to be 100% cured once it has spread. And a good preventative measure is a prostate exam. I'm going to explain what this is and what a normal and an abnormal finding is on a DRE, also known as a digital rectal exam. So a provider is going to put a glove on and they're going to put lube on a finger because that is very courteous. And they're going to insert their finger into the patient's rectum and they are going to feel for the prostate because you cannot see it from the outside. What they want to feel is smooth, and they'll even feel like a little column that separates the left and the right. That's normal. Any stiffness or hardness or any rigidness definitely sparks questioning and requires further investigation. Now that we talked about a common male cancer, let's discuss a female cancer. Breast cancer. What do we think when we see the big pink ribbon? Breast cancer, right? This is the number 2 cancer in women, and it's the number 4 in America. The survival rates of this are increasing. Why do we think that is? Research has gone above and beyond for this cancer, and early detection and proper family history is absolutely key. The first sign, can anyone take a guess at what a first sign would be in detecting breast cancer? Yes, Airman Kincaid. Close. No, you're close. Not quite. You're close. It's feeling a lump. That is a very common sign, feeling a lump. Now, there are different types. I'm just going to go over a few because there are quite a bit. Angiosarcoma. This is cancer that is forming in the blood vessels and in the lymph nodes. Inflammatory breast cancer is rapid cancer that makes the breast red and swollen and very angry. Recurrent breast cancer, that is just simply as it is, cancer that has been treated but has since come back. And something that is called DCIS. That stands for ductal carcinoma in situ. That's just fancy for cancer in the milk duct. However, 5 to 10% are linked to family history. And there is a surgical intervention we can do with this. It is called a mastectomy. What does that mean? It's just surgical removal of the breast. This can be one, this can be both. Now that we've talked about breast cancer, let's shift into number 5 in America. Colorectal cancer, also known as colon cancer for short. Now your colon, this is the final part of the digestive tract. This is also typically found in older adults. We've talked about this before, right? It begins as polyps. I'm going to draw on the marker board what a polyp looks like. A polyp looks like a little berry. Little berry that's just stuck to the inside of something. It's pretty small. That's what a polyp looks like. That's how I describe it. Anyhow, it's by like a little berry. Signs and symptoms of this can be blood in the stool, chronic fatigue that just doesn't go away, unexplained weight loss, and persistent changes in bowel movement. One day, your stool is very hard, and the next day it's soft serve. Like, what the heck is going on? There are screenings for this. Typically want to start over the age of 50. That is a good guideline. However, unless there is a family history otherwise. Now, let's say me, for example, if my grandpa, great-grandpa, my dad, my mother, my sister all have colon cancer, there is a very high chance I'm getting a colonoscopy at age 21. A good way to diagnose this is to biopsy the polyps. Now I'm just going to briefly explain what biopsy is again. It's just taking a little piece of that tissue and putting it in a cup and sending it off to lab. Now, good preventative medicine, something that we can take in place. You are what you eat. Watch the red meat intake. What is bad? Low fiber and high fat. That is not good for your inside. That causes a lot of inflammation. And I'm going to explain what a colonoscopy is. So someone goes in for a colonoscopy, they're going to lay down, they're going to drink this horrible substance called contrast. They're not going to eat or drink anything for several hours. Oh, it's awful. But the provider is going to stick a very large camera that's connected to this big tube, and they're going to shove it up the rectum, and they're going to be able to see everything that's going on in there. They're going to be able to take pictures of everything, and they'll be able to tell you what's actually going on, or not going on, hopefully, in your colon. I know we've talked about a lot so far. A commonality in each of these cancers are that they have an onset at later ages, signs and symptoms don't always show in the beginning, and most of these can be tested with a biopsy. Does anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay. Now let's move on to number 6 in America. Kidney cancer. What are your kidneys? They are 2 little bean-shaped organs that are behind your abdominal cavity. I'm going to turn around real quick, show you where they're at. They're about right here. I'm going to talk about 2 different types, one being adults and it being called renal cell carcinoma. This is just fancy term for saying that cancer has formed in the lining of the small tubes in the kidney. Another one I want to talk about is kids, and it's called Wilms tumor. This is fancy for cancer that forms in the lining tubes in the kidney. Excuse me. Kidney cells develop early as a fetus grows, and sometimes kidney cells don't mature quite fast enough, and it can create tumors on kidneys, specifically in children. There has been an increase in findings. The reason for that is that we've been using CT scans more and more often, and we're finding it completely on accident. There are testing that we can do for this. Blood and urine labs, that's pretty common amongst cancer screenings. We're also going to do imaging and biopsies. There are different stages, and I'm going to draw the stages for you on the marker board. All right. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. Stage 1, normal bean. Stage 2, make him a little bit bigger. Stage 3. I'm going to explain these 2, of course. All right, stage 1, little guy right there attached to it, little guy. Stage 2, he's a little bit bigger, but he's still there. He hasn't gone anywhere yet. Stage 3, oh, now we got to worry. He's attached and he's making his rounds around the body. Close by, not across the whole body yet, but he's close by. And stage 4, bad news. Not only is someone attached to the kidney, but he has now traveled over here and over here in the liver, in the lungs, etc. There are a few treatment options we can do for this. One being a partial or full nephrectomy. Basically, a partial nephrectomy is just removing that bad sucker out of the kidney. Just the bad part of the kidney, take that out. And if full nephrectomy, whole kidney's gotta go. Taking the whole thing, because you can have one kidney, you don't necessarily need 2. We've elaborated on kidneys. Let's now talk about number 7 in America. Bladder cancer. What does the bladder store? Yeah, that's right, urine. This affects approximately 68,000 people yearly. Weirdly enough, 7 out of 10 diagnosed are caught at an early age. The reason for this is urinary tract infections are quite common, and if someone goes in for a urinary tract infection, the signs and symptoms are a little bit similar. However, there's going to be a lot of labs involved with recurrent urinary tract infections, and that's why it may lead to an earlier detection, is because those labs kind of match up hand in hand. Signs and symptoms of this are painful urination, blood in the urine, and this can either look like Kool-Aid or it can look like cola, but if it don't look right, go ahead and get seen. Also pelvic pain, and again, this is tying back into urinary tract infections. Those signs and symptoms are pretty identical. I want to talk about those who are at an increased risk. Smokers, people who have been exposed to radiation in the past, whether it's a prior cancer treatment that they received, and chronic bladder irritations, which I want to talk about next. There are a few different types of bladder cancers. I'm only going to touch on a few. One being called urothelial carcinoma. Urothelial carcinoma. That occurs in the cells in the lining of the bladder, so just right there. And I would like to talk about squamous cell carcinoma. Squamous cell carcinoma. That's basically like chronic irritation, meaning like a catheter that's been in there for a really, really, really long time, and all that just festered and turned into something nasty. For diagnosis, we're gonna do something called a CT urogram, and that's just fancy for a CT test of everything right here. If anyone have ever had contrast, let me tell you how it feels. It gives you a very warm sensation, and it actually made my stomach feel really warm, and it gave me the sensation that I had to pee. Super crazy feeling. Don't recommend it. I'm now going to break down the bladder cancer grades. It's just a little bit different. So there is something called a low-grade tumor and a high-grade. A low-grade tumor grows slowly, it's less likely to invade, and it looks more normal in appearance compared to cells. High-grade is abnormal looking, it's very aggressive, and it's likely to spread to the muscular wall all over here. Now that we've glanced over the bladder, let's learn about number 8 in America. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This originates in the lymphatic system. Well, what's the lymphatic system? Your disease-fighting system in the body. Signs and symptoms of this: swollen lymph nodes, chest pain, shortness of breath, chronic fatigue, unexplained weight loss. And I'd like to tell you guys a story. I saw a patient once that came in, and his neck was so swollen he couldn't even look down. He came in, he was talking like he had a baseball in his mouth, and he's saying, my lymph nodes are swollen and I feel like I can't breathe. We sent him to get imaging done, and it ended up being non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but also his reasoning for shortness of breath was that the lymph nodes in his chest were so swollen that they were pushing on his heart vessels, which was causing him shortness of breath because his heart was always racing. He was 25 years old. Isn't that insane? I want to talk about a few causes of this. Now, I want to break it down a little bit more and talk about something called lymphocytes, and it's a type of white blood cell. Cells are usually created, they live, and then they die, and then there's new ones that replace it. With non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, they don't die. There's a mutation and they keep living, and then there's this oversupply and overproduction of these cells, and that's what's causing the swelling in the lymph nodes. I want to break it down to even more. Something called a T cell. Now, a T cell, they kill foreign invaders. They are the gatekeeper to all of the bad things in the body. And then there's something called a B cell, and these fight infections by producing antibodies. They are the army behind everything that's bad. They work hand in hand together. If we want to diagnose non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, aside from the typical lab and imaging, we're going to do a bone marrow biopsy. I'm going to explain what this is. The patient lays on their back, and a really long needle goes into the very bottom of their spine right here, and they go in the bone marrow and they extract what's inside. I've sat through one before, and the person screamed bloody murder. I wanted to hold their hand. It was a very traumatizing experience. I also want to discuss the stages of this. I do have an audio pulled up, and without reading, I'm just going to go over the pictures and put it in layman's terms. So we have stage 1 over here, and looking at this line, this is our diaphragm. That's we breathe in and breathe out, and that sucker goes in and out. 3 little dots up here, localized, staying in the same spot. Stage 2, Oh, it's above the diaphragm still, but now they've split and they've gone into two separate areas. Moving into stage 3, it's not only up top, but it's also below the diaphragm. So it's spreading a little bit more now, right? Stage 4, not only is it up top and below the diaphragm, it has spread to multiple organs. Let's wrap it up what we've talked about so far. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma originates in the lymphatic system, which is a system that keeps foreigners out. The lymph nodes swell due to overproduction of cells. They just keep going and going and going, and the cells don't die like a usual lifespan. I'd now like to talk about number 9 cancer in America. Thyroid cancer. Thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland in the neck. It's just right below the Adam's apple. And what this little guy is responsible for, he's got a big job. He produces hormones that regulate your heart rate, your temperature, your blood pressure, your weight. Got a lot going on. Thyroid cancer occurs more so in women, and people who are at increased risk are any family history of thyroid problems and, again, exposure to radiation. Let me tell you a story. I told you from the beginning that my mom is a cancer survivor. She actually had nasopharyngeal cancer, and she had radiation to the front of her face. With that, it destroyed her thyroids, and the doctor said, your thyroids are awful. If we don't take these suckers out now, they're going to turn into cancer in the future. So let's just prevent this from happening and let's take them out. She got them taken out. She now takes a medication that kind of acts as her thyroid, but very traumatizing experience. The diagnosis for this is something called an ultrasound, and that's like a little superficial computerized technology that you can get an image, and we want to do what's called an FNA, which stands for fine needle aspiration. What this is a very large needle, and I'm going to come a little bit closer, that goes into the neck, and it's going to go into that thyroid right there, and it's going to pull some of that stuff out. And then again, we're going to put it in a cup, and we're going to send it off to lab. Different types of surgery, I'm only going to go over a few to fix this. One being a thyroidectomy. That means it's removing most, if not all, of the thyroid. Kind of like what my mom went through. Get that sucker out. There's also something called a thyroid lobectomy. And this is when the surgeon removes about half the thyroid. Like, take the bad stuff, get it out. The third one is called lymph node dissection. This is removing not only the thyroid, but nearby lymph nodes that may be at risk. We're almost there, folks. Let's now talk about the number 10 cancer in America. Endometrial cancer. This begins in the uterus. What is the uterus? It is a hollow, pear-shaped organ that's in females, and it sits a little bit lower below the abdominal cavity. This cancer forms in the lining, also known as the endometrium. And if you can look at the picture, it's just this little lining right here. There's the bad stuff. Detection in this can be found early, and the reason for that is if females have abnormal uterine bleeding, they're going to go and get seen by an OBGYN provider. And very common interventions with OBGYN provider is just to get up in there with the camera and see what's going on, and they're going to be able to detect that at an early stage, because this is also a sign and symptom of endometrium cancer is abnormal uterine bleeding. Those who are at risk, smokers, also fluctuations between the balance of hormones, meaning like estrogen and progesterone. With those changes and fluctuations, it can just cause a lot of bad juju in there. And I'm going to tell a story about a friend of mine. Her name is Jessica. She was a chronic smoker. She probably smoked about a pack a day at least. And in July of 2019, she had been diagnosed with stage 4 endometrium cancer. And she actually passed this last October of 2019, and it attributed back to smoking. And she was young. She had 2 kids and a family. It was very, 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 very sad. I want to talk about some surgeries that we can do here. Something called a hysterectomy. This is basically removing the uterus. And you can either do this partially, or you can just take the whole thing out. Also, salpingo-oophorectomy. I love saying that word. This is removing the ovaries and the fallopian tubes. This concludes the first objective in today's lesson. Let's touch up on what we've learned so far. Cancer is a terrible parasite that commonly found in lymph nodes, thyroids, lungs, kidneys, and so much more. It can be detectless, painless, and you may not even know it's there. On a positive note, there is an increase in CT scans that have therefore led to incidental discoveries in early stages such as kidney cancer. We talked about the importance of preventative measures such as colonoscopies and mammograms. Does anyone have any questions? Let's now shift into our final objective. Without reference, identify basic characteristics of old and modern cancer treatments with at least a 70% accuracy. I would like to talk about cancer treatments before the 2000s and modern forms of treatment. I'm going to play a YouTube video for you.
More advanced than anything we've ever seen.
Nothing gets in around.
Time to die, cancer.
All right. Let us roll back in to cancer treatment before the 2000s. We're going to talk about a few different types here. Starting with target therapy. This is a type of treatment that uses drugs designed to target cancer cells instead of normal cells. Cancer cells have changes in their genes that make them a little bit different than normal cells. The target can block, and it can even make cells destroy themselves. I want to emphasize how awesome that is, how we can create something that can just go in there and pick out the good and the bad and even turn it on itself and make it destroy itself. That is phenomenal. I also want to discuss imaging. Back in the day, when imaging wasn't around, providers did something called exploratory surgery. That is literally how it sounds. They opened up abdominal cavities looking for abnormalities. This was because there wasn't cameras. There wasn't this fancy technology that we have today. It wasn't until the 1970s that CT scans and MRIs and PET scans and ultrasounds really took off. These replaced all of those exploratory surgeries, and thank goodness it did. I want to talk about the discovery of chemo. Did you guys know that World War II naval personnel that were exposed to mustard gas later on down the road had bone marrow changes? We were studying those changes. The US Army was actually studying those changes, and they found a compound called nitrogen mustard, which they then tested, and it was confirmed that it was killing lymphoma. It was killing cancer. This had a domino effect in scientists getting motivated to do what else can we do? And it led to more discoveries, and the era of chemo began. I also want to talk about immunotherapy. This is using a person's own immune system to fight the problem. Immune system, it's meant to protect, right? It's meant to keep you strong and keep you safe, but it can't always tell a cancer cell from a normal cell. Again, that's tying back to cancer cells are just a smidge different. Sometimes your immune system can't dictate them apart. This was discovered as well in the 1970s. I also want to talk about the discovery of the X-ray and radiation. German professor Wilhelm Conrad Roentgen discovered this in 1896. He received the first Nobel Prize in 1901. On the contrary, they discovered that radiation was not only curing it, but it was also causing it. A fun radiology fact is back in the day, they used to put their own arm under radiation until their arm turned a light pink color. That was when they said, this is the right dose of radiation for today. And now most of them developed leukemia later on. That's just a fun fact. I want to explain this picture here on the PowerPoint slide. This is called cobalt therapy, and this was used in 1968. And basically what's going on right here is here's the patient laying down, and that machine is just boom, putting gamma rays into that person's body to hopefully fight the cancer. This had some drawbacks, some positives and negatives, but this is what's called cobalt therapy. We've talked about treatments before the 2000s and learned about discoveries such as the X-ray and incidental findings with CT scans. Let's now talk about more common treatments in the world. We're going to watch another YouTube video.
There is a time for war and a time for peace, the Bible says. But inside our body, a continuous war is taking place between disease-causing agents and our own personal army, our immune system. Among the many amazing warriors defending us from within are T cells. T cells are a type of white blood cell that is equipped to identify foreign threats. They have a CD28 protein receptor that makes them more active and potent. They also have a PD-1 receptor that calms them down, avoiding autoimmune diseases. Equipped also with a TCR receptor, T cells can scan our body for malicious foreign agents and destroy them. But what do you do when the enemy is one of your own cells? Cancer cells are our own cells gone rogue. They also have the ability to trick T cells by sending PD-L1 proteins that suppress them. They may slip through, resulting in cancer. Professor Cyril Cohen and his colleagues at Bar-Ilan University set out to give T cells a little help. They devised a chimeric protein molecule using the receptor part of the PD-1 and the base part of the CD28. So now those fraudulent PD-L1 proteins are received by the PD-1 receptor of the chimera, but the effect is reversed. Using an engineered virus, they deliver the genetic code of the new protein to T cells and sent them off to fight human cancer cells in vitro and in mice. The new protein load also included a bonus feature of improved cancer recognition capabilities. The results of the experiment showed a regression of tumors. another step forward for T-cell based immunotherapy and for the ongoing battle against cancer.
Is that not a super cool video? Technical difficulties. Pause that little sucker. Take two. Let's try that again. All right. Let's now talk about some modern forms of cancer treatment. Let's begin with cryosurgery. This is basically using liquid nitrogen spray to freeze a lesion or kill abnormal cells. Has anyone ever had a wart frozen off, like when they were a kid or even when they were older, like on their hands or their feet? Yeah, it's the same thing with that little gun, and it shoots really, really, really cold and it kills it all. I also want to talk about lasers. These can cut through tissues without the use of a scalpel and can burn cancers. It's common in like OBGYN practices that they can get in the cervical cavity and can burn certain lesions off, like if someone has had an abnormal pap smear. Also want to touch up again on chemo. Chemo now can be given orally through an IV, like intravenous blood work in the arm. It can be given by injection. It can be used before surgery or before radiation therapy. It can shrink that sucker up a little bit so that surgery can begin. It can also be used after radiation or after surgery to take out whatever little bit is left behind the chemo can kill. It can also be used if cancer ever tries to come back for whatever reason. We can reuse chemo and kill that sucker back down. I also want to talk about bone marrow transplant and stem cell transplant, an amazing discovery. This is taking someone else's bone marrow, okay? Taking someone else's bone marrow and injecting it into another compatible human. That is insane. Another word for this is stem cell transplant. I'm gonna go back to my mom for a second. So my mother is a twin, and she was told at one point, due to all the radiation exposure and the chemo exposure from her past, that she could develop leukemia later on in her life. Well, her twin sister, Dina, is absolutely willing to donate marrow at any given time. And how awesome is that we have created such technology that my mom's twin sister can potentially save her life. That is unreal. I want to talk a little bit how stem cells can replace blood forming cells destroyed by radiation or chemo. And what we need in a blood forming cell is your white blood cell, your red blood cell, and platelets. White blood cells, they're the suckers that fight infection. Red blood cells, they carry the oxygen to and fro. And platelets, they clot the blood. You need all three of those to make up a blood forming cell. And that's exactly what stem cell transplant is doing. It's out with the old and in with the new. Let's wrap this up. We've talked about so many different things today. And to elaborate a little bit more, without reference, we identified basic characteristics of the top 10 cancers in the US with at least 70% accuracy. We talked about skin cancer and how that's the number one. We discussed lung cancer and how smokers have a high risk at that. We also talked about the female and male common cancers such as prostate cancer and breast cancer. We also discussed colorectal cancer and how colonoscopy is very important. We discussed kidney cancer and bladder cancer, also non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid cancer, which is almost what my mother developed, and endometrial cancer. Our second objective, we also discussed basic characteristics of old and modern cancer treatments. We talked about cancer treatments before the 2000s, when X-ray was becoming a thing, and when the German professor invented it and how it led to incidental discoveries, because then we started getting the ball rolling and what else can we do? We can invent x-rays. Well, now let's invent the CT scan. Let's invent the MRI. We also talked about modern forms of cancer treatment, which is how chemo can be used in many different ways now, such as an oral, like a pill. You can take it through an IV. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me, I just sneezed, I'm sorry. We also talked about how we can use cryotherapy and liquid nitrogen in a little gun, and we can use that to like freeze a wart off. Medicine is evolving rapidly, and it's quite astonishing. I can't imagine what we will discover in 10, 20, even 50 years from now. As someone who has personally experienced cancer in my family, such as my mom, and even if you're including the extended family, like what happened with my friend Jessica and her endometrial cancer, or even my foster mom, Sam, she was in the hospital having an entire lung removed. I want nothing more than to find a cure and kick cancer to the curb. We can only go up from here. Research can only skyrocket from here. There is constant organizations and fundraising events that is all going towards this research, and all of that is so crucial to our future, to our children's future, and even to our children's children's future. Does anyone have any questions on today's lecture? Yes, Airman Kincaid? Yeah, you want me to brush up again on melanoma and like why would you biopsy something versus not biopsy? Yeah, you know what? Let me pull that up on the marker board. Let me draw you what a normal lesion would look like and what an abnormal lesion would look like. That is a great question. My eraser just broke. That's cool. Okay. Draw a line here. I'm going to draw one mole, one over here, and one over here. So we wouldn't want to really biopsy this one over here on the left because it is round, it's smooth, it's all one color for the most part. It's not too concerning. We can monitor it over the years, absolutely. And if it changes shape at any time, we'll go for and punch biopsy that sucker. But the one over here, you see how it's irregularly shaped? It's got some dots on there. Not quite sure what that miscoloration is all about, but something about it isn't growing quite right. It's changing shape and it's a little bit concerning. So we are going to biopsy this guy and we are only going to monitor this guy unless something changes. Does that answer your question? Of course, absolutely. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to bring up? If no one has any questions, again, I will be staying back for anyone who has stage fright and doesn't want to necessarily answer questions in front of people. Totally fine with me. Otherwise, we're going to take a 10-minute break and we will be back for the next lecture. Thank you, everyone.